Hello again. Glad to see you back. Before we talk about genetics, laws, or markets, I want to talk about respect, because this plant has carried more than names or numbers. It's carried people through time, through struggle, through misunderstanding. It grew for those who had nothing, and it kept growing long before anyone thought to measure it. What we've built today, the science, the systems, the shelves, all of it came from that simple act of survival. So this isn't just another story about cannabis, it's a conversation with what made it possible. Let's listen, not to what the world says about the plant, but to what the plant has been saying all along. This channel was never about me. It was never about faces, filters, or building a brand around an image. It was built because somewhere between the grow rooms, the boardrooms, and the hashtags, cannabis lost its voice. What once spoke through fields, families, and phenotypes was replaced by marketing scripts and genetic reruns. Every time someone told me, "Show yourself," I thought about how the plant no longer could, how the living thing that changed human history had been turned into a mascot for everything except itself. So I decided not to compete with it. I decided to let the plant speak again. This channel exists because we stopped teaching. We taught yield, lighting, extraction, compliance, everything except the living intelligence beneath it all. We replaced observation with algorithms, mentorship with marketing. We turned the plant into a commodity, then called that progress. But the plant doesn't need another influencer. It needs an interpreter. It needs someone willing to translate its chemistry back into language, not hype, not mysticism, but understanding. When I make these videos, I'm not teaching strain reviews or trends. I'm trying to rebuild literacy in a language that humans used to be fluent in before profit rewrote the grammar. People ask why I stay behind the screen. The truth is, anonymity keeps the focus where it belongs. If I became the face of this channel, the story would tilt toward personality instead of preservation. The moment cannabis education turns into self-branding, the message collapses into noise. By removing myself, I create a silence the plant can fill, and if you listen closely, that silence speaks louder than any face could. I don't want followers who recognize me. I want thinkers who start recognizing the plant again, the trichomes, the resin heads, the branching chemistry of cannabinoids. That's the real identity here. What I'm trying to build is a record, a living archive of what cannabis truly is before it's reduced again. Every topic, every frame, every word is meant to reconnect us to a species that has shaped human evolution without ever asking for credit. This is about cannabis as a teacher, not a trophy. It's about restoring context in an age obsessed with consumption. The plant doesn't need defending, it needs remembering. When people finally see that, they start to understand why the old growers spoke about their plants like they were speaking about family, because in a way, they were. So when I don't show my face, it isn't mystery, it's respect. The point isn't to be seen, it's to see clearly. Cannabis doesn't need another name trying to own it. It needs a generation willing to listen. That's why this channel exists. Not for fame, not for followers, but to put the story back where it belongs. In the soil, in the code, and in the truth that the plant still carries, even when we forget how to. Cannabis is losing its memory. Not the cultural kind, written in folklore or strain names, but the kind that lives in code, in the silent exchanges of DNA that once allowed it to change with the earth. For thousands of years, it evolved as a shape-shifting survivor, adapting to mountain wind in Mazar, humid equator in Congo, arid plains in Rajasthan, and temperate valleys of the Mediterranean. Each region wrote a different verse into the plant's genome, some for fiber, some for medicine, some for resin, others for resilience. Those verses were once infinite variations of possibility, a polyphonic orchestra of alleles tuned by sun, soil, and time. But the modern industry, obsessed with uniformity disguised as innovation, has compressed that orchestra into a single repetitive note: high THC, market-ready sameness. Over the last 50 years, prohibition and commercialization have joined forces to flatten what evolution built. The underground era, for all its creative rebellion, funneled diversity into secrecy. Growers crossed what they could hide, not what the plant needed to survive. The result was a generation of hybrids inbred for stealth, short, dense, chemically predictable. When legalization arrived, those same genotypes became the genetic foundation of modern commerce. Now, what fills dispensary jars from California to Copenhagen shares more in common with itself than with its ancestral lineages. Whole continents of expression, terpene spectra, cannabinoid ratios, photoperiodic timing are collapsing into a single commercial dialect. What we sell as variety is often branding layered over repetition. Genetic testing across global dispensary samples has shown less heterogeneity among different strains than between two heirloom tomatoes grown in separate gardens. This is how extinction begins in slow motion, not with the last plant dying in the wild, but with every surviving plant becoming too similar to matter. A true genetic bottleneck is not just a lack of options, it's the loss of potential itself. The cannabis genome has been funneled through the narrow neck of market expectation, leaving behind the subtle architecture that made it resilient, the bitter terpenes that deter pests, the minor cannabinoids that shaped neurochemical nuance, the root morphologies that endured flood or drought. When a species forgets how to vary, it forgets how to survive. The next pathogen, the next environmental stressor, or the next global supply shift could erase half the commercial library overnight, not through regulation, but through biology reclaiming balance. The tragedy is not just agronomic, it's philosophical. The plant that once symbolized diversity of consciousness now faces the same monocultural fate as the crops it once stood apart from. Cannabis became the mirror of human ambition. Everything about control, nothing about coexistence. Instead of selecting for balance, we bred for dominance, for numbers, yields, and potency metrics that look good in spreadsheets, but hollow out the species that provide them. Each clone propagated across states, each stabilized F1 bred for shelf appeal, is another brick in the narrowing tunnel. The irony of legalization is that it made cannabis visible, but not freer. What prohibition hid, capitalism homogenized. Yet the story isn't terminal. Beneath the marketplace repetition, ancient genetics still pulse in forgotten seed jars, backyard collections, and vaults maintained by preservationists who understood what science and law were too slow to protect. Every landrace preserved in a remote valley, every seed bank recording forgotten chemotypes, every academic archive that stores cryogenic pollen is a form of resistance. Reversing the bottleneck begins with listening to those silent archives, with valuing preservation not as nostalgia, but as infrastructure for the future. Because the genome isn't just code, it's the living documentation of how adaptation looks in motion. If cannabis is to survive its own domestication, it must be rewilded, not by abandoning cultivation, but by reconnecting cultivation to complexity. This means restoring its dialects, reopening the allelic corridors closed by profit and policy, and allowing the plant to remember itself. Every breeder who saves a seed from erasure, every researcher who maps expression beyond THC, every policymaker who protects genetic exchange contributes to that recovery. The mission is not to own the plant's future, but to keep it plural. For a species that has always thrived in diversity, salvation looks like difference, not more of the same. The genetic collapse didn't arrive like a storm. It came as convenience, one cut, one clone, one predictable harvest at a time. Each replication looked like efficiency on paper, cleaner production schedules, consistent cannabinoid output, repeatable yields. But beneath that mechanical rhythm, something ancient went silent. In traditional agriculture, farmers saved seed to preserve resilience. In cannabis, cloning replaced that cycle with paralysis. We traded evolution for replication. Every time a cultivar was stabilized for market dependability, thousands of potential offspring, thousands of chemical permutations were never born. The industry built its empire not on diversity, but on arrested development. The original breeders, the ones who worked in secrecy during Prohibition, never intended this outcome. They selected for survival under pressure plants that finished early under weak light, that resisted mold in basements, that tolerated stress. Their goal was continuity, not conformity. But when legalization scaled those genetics into commercial breeding programs, the pressure changed. No longer environmental, now economic. Instead of survival, the new goal was reproducibility. Each phenotype that deviated from the target became a liability. And with that single market correction, cannabis entered its monocultural phase. Laboratories became greenhouses, greenhouses became factories, and in every factory the genome grew thinner. This narrowing didn't just erase chemical diversity, it began to rewrite sensory memory. Consumers were taught to expect sameness. Marketing language replaced botanical literacy. What had once been described in terms of resin texture, aromatic weight, or flowering behavior was reduced to 3 letters, THC, and an imaginary spectrum of indica to sativa. When numbers and labels took over, the feedback loop of genuine observation collapsed. Breeders stopped listening to plants and started listening to spreadsheets. This is how biodiversity dies, not through destruction, but through distraction. The market convinces you that the most common expression is the most valuable one, until even the scientists studying the genome forget that difference was the plant's first form of intelligence. In nature, cannabis was never a single idea. Its genome is modular, a living toolkit for adaptation. Some alleles shape trichome density, others influence cannabinoid synthase efficiency, drought response, or terpene volatility. When that code shrinks, it's not just the plant that becomes weaker, the entire scientific potential of the species diminishes. Each lost allele is an untested medicine, an unexpressed aroma, an unrecorded solution to climate stress. Evolution gifted cannabis a kind of chemical improvisation, and the industry responded by demanding a script. The irony is that the more predictable we've made it, the less alive it has become. This is the hidden cost of control, stability without soul. 1,000 strains, all wearing the same expression. Genetic databases that look deep but read shallow, filled with synonyms for the same Afghan skunk cross in different packaging. What we once called breeding has, in many places, become recycling. The genome keeps folding back on itself like an echo chamber, mutating not through exploration, but exhaustion. Even when new cannabinoids are discovered, they emerge from the same compressed ancestry, like finding new words in a dying language. The brilliance of cannabis was never just in its chemistry. It was in its capacity to evolve faster than the systems trying to define it. Now, those systems are winning, but the genome still remembers. Seeds don't forget their ancestors. They wait for permission to speak them again. The allelic corridors that prohibition forced underground are still there, dormant but intact. The task isn't to invent new genetics, it's to reawaken the old ones. That begins with humility, acknowledging that the plant's intelligence exceeds our economic frameworks, that every forgotten land race still carries an ecological memory modern hybrids no longer need, but will again. The path back to diversity starts with one truth that the market cannot patent. The plant does not serve us. We serve the plant by keeping it plural. Before the licenses, before the labs and the harvest reports, there were mountains. That's where I learned the language of the plant, not from spreadsheets or seminars, but from soil, cold water, and the sound of wind on tarp. We carried everything on our backs because wheels couldn't make the climb. The first leg was always the same. The pickup to the cut line, the ATV waiting under a tarp, the climb that turned lungs into metronomes. Every load mattered. Every footprint left a signature you didn't want found. The mission wasn't rebellion, it was reverence. Grow without leaving a scar. The first rule was water. You could find a perfect slope, perfect sun angle, perfect canopy break, and lose it all to a bad stream. We tested every source with old field strips and instinct. If the flow ran alkaline or smelled of iron, we moved sometimes miles deeper. The plant taught patience that way. Before it could take root, so did we. The days blurred into systems of necessity, clearing just enough brush for light, digging catch basins by hand, anchoring tarps against weather that never cared about your timing. It wasn't glamorous. It was apprenticeship by hardship. Up there, you learn that cultivation isn't about control, it's about permission. The mountain allows you to stay if you learn its rhythm. The soil isn't a substrate, it's an agreement. You don't chase yield, you chase balance. Every haul of equipment was an offering to that balance. Pumps, hoses, filters, bags of soil amendment packed light enough not to carve trails. We weren't breeding for trophies. We didn't have testing labs or strain names printed on foil. We had the quiet knowledge that health and potency were inseparable from respect. You could see it in the leaves, the difference between growth and stress, between greed and gratitude. A month at elevation changes you. Time slows to the plant's pace. You start to understand why early cultivators spoke in weather patterns and soil moods instead of metrics. There was no room for vanity. The mountain stripped that away. You learned humility from failure, resilience from frost, and reverence from every dawn that revealed the work still standing. We weren't chasing indica or sativa. Those words didn't mean anything out there. We grew what survived, and survival, it turns out, was a far better teacher than yield. That's why it cuts so deep, watching today's market chase a chemical horizon that doesn't exist. In the wilderness, nobody talked about percentage. We didn't even have a way to measure it. Yet, those old plants, diverse, untested, unbranded, carried the same fire the industry now quantifies and sells by the decimal. The irony is unbearable. Everything that made cannabis sacred in practice has been stripped to make it profitable in presentation. The pursuit of the highest number replaced the pursuit of understanding, and in doing so, we erased the very instinct that once guided us through the dark. The legacy growers of those Oregon mountains weren't building empires, they were keeping memory alive. Each season was a conversation with nature about possibility, not performance. We learned that the plant's strength wasn't in its output, but in its adaptability. Every microclimate, every subtle shift in soil bacteria, every breath of mist off a creek changed the chemical conversation in its resin. That is what diversity meant before genetics became marketing copy, living variation shaped by relationship, not by demand. Now, when I talk about genetic bottlenecks and the loss of resilience, I'm not speaking from theory. I'm speaking from memory. I've watched the plant adapt faster than our culture can comprehend, and I've watched our culture punish that adaptability in favor of control. The mountain never needed certification to teach ethics. It only needed silence. And in that silence, the plant spoke with the same message it always has. Everything that grows in harmony thrives. Everything that grows for attention withers. When I first stepped out of the tree line and into the world of compliance, it felt like betrayal. After years of learning from the mountain, where the rules were written in weather and soil instead of policy and code, the sight of clipboards, state seals, and regulatory acronyms felt foreign. I used to think that legalization was a wall built by people who didn't understand the plant, a system built to civilize what didn't need taming. And maybe, at first, it was. But over time, I realized that compliance wasn't the enemy. It was another dialect of the same language, one that had been created not to silence the plant, but to give it a legitimate voice in a world that had forgotten how to listen. At the beginning, I resisted it. The language of law felt clinical, stripped of soil and scent. It was water pipe instead of bong, adult use cannabis instead of weed, will instead of might. Every word felt like a translation that had lost its poetry. But the longer I studied it, the more I realized that compliance isn't censorship, it's code switching. It's how we make the plant understood in rooms where it was once condemned. The legal system doesn't speak chlorophyll, it speaks liability, precedent, and terminology. To survive in that environment, the plant needs interpreters, and that's what I've become. Learning this language didn't mean surrendering the old one. It meant bridging them. The regulatory frameworks, the testing standards, labeling laws, pesticide limits are just another way of measuring respect. On the mountain, we called it sustainability. In the market, it's compliance. The vocabulary changed, but the principle stayed the same. Protect what you love by understanding its boundaries. It took me years to accept that structure isn't always suppression. Sometimes it's preservation in disguise. That's why I no longer argue against the legal system outright. I argue against its misuse. I'm not opposed to regulated markets or controlled cultivars. I'm opposed to misinformation, the kind that filters through the industry disguised as truth, the kind that tells people high THC equals high quality, that erases the science of entourage effects, that ignores agricultural balance for market optics. Compliance should have made the industry more accountable, but too often it's been twisted into a marketing tool instead of an educational framework. That's what I'm here to challenge. If the old world of cannabis taught me anything, it's that knowledge is the plant's truest form of protection. Regulation can't replace wisdom, but it can protect it if guided by the right hands. When I talk about the genetic bottleneck, how the plant is being funneled into a single, narrow lineage of marketable sameness, I'm not just talking about genetics. I'm talking about thought, about how the conversation itself has become a bottleneck. Compliance, marketing, science, activism, they've all been poured into the same shot glass, and now we're arguing over whose sip matters most. But the truth is, the glass isn't the problem. It's how small we've made it. The plant was never meant to fit inside a single framework. It's a system of infinite variables, chemical, ecological, spiritual, cultural. To confine that to paperwork and potency charts is to miss the point entirely. My goal now is to expand that glass until it overflows, to remind regulators, educators, and cultivators alike that the plant story doesn't end with legal definitions or lab results. It ends where understanding begins. Compliance isn't the destination, it's the dialect. The language of preservation just changed its syntax, and if learning it means the plant can finally be heard in courtrooms, classrooms, and conversations where it was once silenced, then maybe this is what evolution looks like. The plant doesn't fear translation, it fears distortion. And that's why I'm here, to keep its message clear while the world argues over who gets to speak it. Somewhere along the way, the cannabis industry decided that the entire identity of the plant could fit inside a shot glass. Every sector, cultivation, retail, media, education, and regulation, poured itself in, convinced that its contents were the most important. At first, it looked full of potential, but then everyone started drinking from it at once, and the volume never changed. That's what happens when progress becomes a competition instead of a collaboration. The container doesn't expand, it just overflows, spilling the parts that mattered most: context, honesty, and humility. Cultivation used to be the root of knowledge, the place where observation, failure, and adaptation wrote the plant's story. Now, it's often a race for scale. The art of tending has become the science of extraction, and the field has become a factory. Instead of thousands of small hands learning from thousands of microclimates, a few companies manage entire climates from screens. It's efficient, but it's sterile. The plants live, but the knowledge doesn't. When the hands disappear, so does the intimacy that made cultivation sacred. The growers of today aren't less skilled. They're just forced to fit skill into a system that doesn't value nuance. Retail, the next layer of that glass, is where communication broke first. The people who once guided others through scent, story, and shared experience now have to talk in percentages, branding, and compliance blurbs. The bud tender was supposed to be a translator, a bridge between chemistry and experience, but too often the system reduces them to cashiers for chemistry they aren't allowed to explain. Regulation silences them for liability, marketing manipulates them for profit. In the middle, the truth gets lost in transaction. When education is replaced by sales, the conversation becomes an echo chamber of whatever moves the fastest. Education itself hasn't escaped the squeeze. Institutions that once ignored cannabis now rush to claim ownership of its study, offering certifications and coursework that sound official but often teach nothing of depth. They separate cannabis from its culture and history. They treat it as a new subject, not an ancient conversation. True education doesn't just catalog data, it contextualizes it. But that kind of learning doesn't fit easily inside the industry's new glass because it requires time, reflection, and contradiction, three things the market rarely allows. Then there's regulation, the structure meant to protect. It's the rim of the glass, the thing keeping everything contained. It was designed to stabilize the industry, but in stabilizing it, regulation also froze it. Instead of evolving with the science, the rules often lag behind it, turning safeguards into stagnation. Policy becomes dogma, and the people who question it are treated as agitators instead of advocates. Compliance was supposed to create legitimacy, but when wielded without nuance, it creates silence. And finally, media, the loudest pour of all. It amplifies every voice except the plant's. Algorithms reward spectacle, not substance. The louder you shout, the more visible you become, and soon credibility is measured by views instead of values. The plant, once a symbol of introspection, becomes a prop for engagement metrics. The digital echo chamber doesn't inform, it consumes. That's the shot glass, a tiny container overflowing with people trying to own what can't be owned. We have cultivated an industry that is wide in reach but narrow in vision. And the more we fill that glass with data, regulation, and branding, the less space there is for the plant itself. My mission, this channel's purpose, is to widen the container, not by emptying it, but by expanding it, by reconnecting these divided sectors with the same principle that used to govern the soil: communication. When cultivators talk to scientists, when regulators listen to educators, when retailers become teachers again, when media stops chasing noise, that's when the glass starts to stretch. That's when the plant finally has room to breathe. Truth is the expansion. Education is the pressure that pushes the walls outward. And understanding, real, unbiased, data-backed understanding, is what keeps the glass from shattering under its own weight. The goal isn't to pour more in, it's to make more space for what's already there. Because the plant doesn't need us to speak louder, it needs us to listen wider. Everything I've said, everything I've built, comes down to this. The plant has been speaking all along. We just stopped listening. From the mountains of Oregon to the boardrooms of compliance, I've watched it whisper through soil, circuitry, and legislation, adapting every time we tried to define it. That's the brilliance of cannabis, its refusal to stay still. It doesn't belong to the underground or the industry. It belongs to the continuum that connects both. The mountain taught me reverence. Compliance taught me translation. The science taught me precision. Together they form the language I speak now, not as an authority, but as a witness to what the plant has always been trying to say. We've spent decades bottlenecking that language, squeezing centuries of evolution into a shot glass built for comfort and control. But the plant isn't here to fit in our containers. It's here to remind us what happens when diversity becomes inconvenience and when curiosity is replaced by marketing. The genetics collapsing in labs today mirror the same collapse happening in culture, a narrowing of thought disguised as progress. We made the plant uniform because we made ourselves that way first. Breaking that cycle means returning to relationship, not regulation, to biology, not branding. When I talk about rewilding cannabis, I'm not talking about returning to the woods. I'm talking about returning to wonder, about restoring the kind of humility that existed when a grower's first responsibility was to learn, not to sell. The same instinct that guided me through those Oregon ridges still guides me now, to leave less of a footprint than the knowledge I gain. Every plant, every phenotype, every soil test was a lesson in balance, and balance is the one thing the modern industry keeps mistaking for weakness. Balance isn't stagnation, it's sustainability measured through time, not trend. That's why this channel exists, to rebuild the connection between the plant and the people who claim to represent it. Not to shame, not to divide, but to realign the conversation around truth. Because truth is not branding. Truth is observation refined by respect. If we want to reverse the bottleneck, genetic, cultural, or intellectual, we have to expand the language again. We have to let scientists speak to cultivators, let regulators listen to farmers, and let consumers hear the plant, not the marketing campaign built around it. Communication is the cure. Transparency is the soil. Knowledge is the light that brings it back to life. I didn't come here to be seen. I came here to remember. Every page, every episode, every word in this series is a record of that remembering, an effort to translate what the plant still knows. That diversity is not a luxury, it's a survival mechanism. The cannabis genome is a living library of adaptation, and every time we close a chapter for convenience, we burn a book we might one day need. So to everyone watching, studying, questioning, this is our chance to listen wider, to expand the glass, to reopen the genome, to make room for difference again. This isn't nostalgia for the old days or resistance to the new. It's a reminder that evolution only works when variation is allowed to breathe. The plant doesn't need saving, it needs space. And before I close this arc, I want to acknowledge the inspiration that sparked this conversation. A shout out to Mickey Earthley, whose words about the genetic bottleneck reminded me that what we're doing here matters. Respect to the ones who speak truth into the noise and remind us that the plant's survival depends on collective honesty, not competition. All of this, is the new voice of the plant. Not a single mouthpiece, but a chorus of growers, scientists, educators, and listeners. The future of cannabis isn't in the lab or the market. It's in the space between them. The soil of understanding we build together will decide what the plant becomes next. If you've stayed with me through this entire arc, from the myths to the mountains, through the compliance halls and the echo of the shot glass, thank you. You're part of the reason this conversation still has meaning. Every view, every comment, every moment you choose to listen instead of scroll, it keeps this dialogue alive. What we're building here isn't an audience, it's an ecosystem. One where growers, consumers, educators, and advocates share one unspoken agreement that this plant still has more to teach us than we have to say about it. This is why I don't show my face. Because this isn't about me. It's about the voice we all share when we care enough to ask deeper questions. Every episode, every discussion, every piece of content here exists to widen the conversation, to give language back to the plant, and to keep truth from getting lost in translation. My promise is simple. I will always speak with respect, stay rooted in data, and never trade clarity for clicks. We've covered the myths, we've traced the bottleneck, we've listened to the science and the soil, but this moment right here is the part that matters most, where curiosity meets care and where information becomes integrity. The plant doesn't need idols, it needs interpreters, and if you've made it this far, you've already proven you're one of them. If you took something meaningful from this series, let it grow. Share it, question it, challenge it, and keep the dialogue alive wherever you can, at your local shop, in your grow room, or just with someone who still believes THC percent tells the whole story. That's how we rebuild understanding, not by preaching, but by planting ideas that grow on their own. To Mickey Earthley and everyone out there speaking for preservation, for education, and for truth, thank you. The conversation doesn't end here, it evolves. And as always, this content is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is intended to promote or encourage the use, sale, or cultivation of cannabis where prohibited by law. Always follow your local and state regulations and consume responsibly where it's legal to do so. Thank you for being part of this journey, for standing with reason over rhetoric, and for giving the plant a voice beyond marketing. Until next time, keep listening wider, thinking deeper, and staying rooted in truth. Because the plant isn't just growing, it's remembering.